Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at this article from the front page of the Delhi edition. 26 Palestinians, including Hamas militants and civilians, have been killed as Israel has targeted Gaza Strip again with airstrikes. Over the last few days, a new wave of violence has gripped the regions of Israel and Palestine as tensions between Israelis and Palestinians has increased over the last few days. These tensions between Israelis and Palestinians has been building up since the start of the Ramzan season, and Israeli armed forces were preventing the Palestinian Arabs or the Palestinian Muslims from entering and praying at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which happens to be the third holiest site in Islam. After Mecca and Medina, Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem is considered to be the third holiest site in Islam. And since mid-April, Israeli police and armed forces had barricaded the mosque and they were preventing the Palestinians from gathering over there. This led to heightened tensions between Israeli security forces and the Palestinians. And in the middle of these heightened tensions, Israeli authorities permitted far right-wing Zionists to undertake the Jerusalem Day March, which brought these far right-wing Jews in direct confrontation with the Palestinian Muslims. As tensions increased in the area surrounding the mosque, Israeli armed forces stormed the mosque in a controversial move, leading to injuries amongst Palestinian pilgrims. Israeli armed forces alleged that the Palestinians were preparing for violence and they retaliated in defense. But however, on-ground reports indicate that the Israeli armed forces carried out an unprovoked retaliation, leading to widespread violence, injuries, and detentions amongst Palestinians. Prior to this raid by the Israeli armed forces, clashes had occurred between far right-wing Jews and Palestinian Muslims, which had led to heightened tensions in the region. Following these tensions and escalation in violence, Hamas militants from the Gaza Strip started launching rockets into populated areas in Israel, which ended up killing and injuring many Israelis. In retaliation, Israeli armed forces have carried out a massive airstrike in the Gaza Strip, where a number of Palestinians have been killed, including few militants and as well as civilians. This sudden escalation in violence and tensions in the Israel-Palestine region happens to be one of the gravest escalation in violence that we have seen of late in the West Asia region. And to further understand these developments in detail, we need to look at the background to this issue. Many of you might know that Jerusalem is a sacred city where the three Abrahamic religions were born, that includes Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. During the ancient times, following crusades and religious wars, the Jews were driven out of Jerusalem, and for centuries, this had become the homeland of the Palestinian Arabs. After losing their homeland, the Jews roamed around Europe for centuries, before eventually facing persecution and Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis. So the Jews, who were persecuted for centuries together, were demanding the creation of a native homeland in the 1800s and early 1900s. And through the 1917 Balfour Declaration, Britain promised to create a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And this decision was taken unilaterally by the United Kingdom and the United States, without consulting the Arab states, and without even consulting the Palestinians who had become native to this region. So essentially, the United Kingdom and the United States were attempting a communal partition of this region located in and around Jerusalem, and accordingly they pushed for a UN partition plan in 1947, which proposed a two-state solution. As per the two-state solution, a separate Palestinian state for Muslims was supposed to be created, along with a separate state for the Jews known as Israel. Initially, this unilateral communal partition plan was opposed by several countries, including India. But later, the UN partition plan came to be accepted as the most reasonable solution, which would do justice to both the communities. But before this UN partition plan could be implemented, and before the two-state solution could be enforced, Israel declared unilateral independence in 1948 in direct violation of the UN and the international community. And the Arab states immediately retaliated against the newly created state of Israel by declaring war against Israel in support of the Palestinians. Through this unilateral illegal move, Israel had snatched away the rights of the Palestinians, And in this ensuing conflict between Israel and the Arab states, Israel managed to defeat all the Arab states with the support of US and UK. And as you can see in these two maps, the Palestinian territory was drastically reduced. As per the UN two-state solution, there was supposed to be a division that would create two independent nations, one for the Palestinian Arabs and one for the Jews. The territorial limits of Palestine and Israel were supposed to look like this, with Jerusalem being given the status of an international city, considering its ancient historical cultural significance. But in a unilateral move, Israel declared independence, fought a war against all the Arab countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the others, and defeated all the Arab states and significantly expanded its territory in contravention to the UN proposal, and significantly diminished Palestinian territory into this narrow strip over here known as the Gaza Strip that faces the Mediterranean Sea, and to this region known as the West Bank, which was located to the west of the Jordan River. Following this war, Israel managed to occupy the western parts of Jerusalem, and the West Bank region over here next to the Jordan River was occupied by the then government of Jordan. Then a couple of decades later, in 1967, the Six-Day War broke out between Israel and Arab countries, during which Israel further enhanced its control over Palestinian areas, and it even occupied many Arab territories as well. It captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, which was later returned in 1992 after signing a peace treaty. It entirely captured West Bank, that is East Jerusalem, from Jordan, and since then Israel annexed this area, and it is this part of Jerusalem that is currently in news as a result of the clashes. Then Israel even captured the Golan Heights from Syria during this war, and it went on to occupy the Gaza Strip and impose a naval blockade against the Gaza Strip. In retaliation to this aggressive territorial expansionism by Israel, Palestinian extremists, with the support of many Arab states, launched a violent extremist movement against Israel and the Western countries, which is referred to as the Intifada, which lasted for several years. Eventually, temporary peace was achieved with the mediation of the United States through the signing of the Oslo Accords and through the Camp David Summit. But continued violence by Israel against Palestinians and the continued oppression of Palestinians triggered the second wave of militancy against Israel known as the Second Intifada. Throughout this violent period of struggle in the Israel-Palestine region, Israel is known to use excessive force against Palestinians, and Palestinian extremist outfits such as the Hamas, which is said to be backed by Iran and which is centered in the Gaza Strip, is known to launch violent attacks against Israel, including against civilian establishments. So whenever Palestinian extremist outfits like Hamas launch rocket attacks against Israeli population, Israel retaliates with disproportionate force by launching aerial strikes and military strikes against the Gaza Strip. While Hamas also stands accused of committing acts of terrorism, Israel also stands accused of violating human rights. And on many instances, several countries, including India, have voted against Israel at the United Nations and at the UN Human Rights Council on resolutions that have accused Israel of committing grave human rights violations against the Palestinians. Then coming to present day, Israel has completely altered the status quo, and as you can see in this map, it has significantly reduced Palestinian territories. It has completely occupied Jerusalem, and it has been pushing illegal Jewish settlements, and this has completely eroded the rights of the Palestinians. So within the old city of Jerusalem, there are several holy sites that are considered to be sacred in both Islam and Judaism. And in this map, you can clearly see the different quarters that Jerusalem has been divided into in the West Bank region. And in a neighborhood known as Sheikh Jarrah, an old land title dispute has been going on between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish settlers. See, back in 1948, when Israel illegally declared independence on its own, and when it started reducing Palestinian territory, the Palestinians referred to this event as the Nakba or as the catastrophe. Following these events, a few Palestinian families, they moved to this region known as Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, that is in East Jerusalem, and they settled in this region, which then was administered by Jordan as East Jerusalem was under Jordan. But following the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem, including Sheikh Jarrah from Jordan, and from then, several Jewish authorities have demanded that the Palestinian families should quit that land. And by citing age-old legal disputes, many Jewish communities have tried to reclaim this land from the Palestinian natives. So this land title dispute was going on in Israeli courts, and recently the Israeli judiciary ruled in favor of the Jewish settlers, thereby triggering anxiety and tensions amongst the Palestinians. So while this land title dispute was going on, parallelly, the Israeli armed forces created tensions around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is located in the same compound as that of the Temple Mount and the Dome of Rock, which are considered to be extremely sacred in Judaism. Within this compound, next to Temple Mount, is the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, which is considered to be the holiest site in Judaism. And since many centuries, there have been tensions between Jews and Muslims over access and ownership to these sacred areas. But the recent attempt of the Israeli armed forces to block entry to Palestinians to the sacred mosque, that too during the Ramzan season, started raising tensions. And parallelly, the permission given to right-wing Zionists to carry out a march led to clashes on both the sides, resulting in violence. And eventually, the Israeli armed forces raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, leading to further violence and clashes. And in retaliation to these violent events and the excessive use of force by Israeli forces, Hamas, which operates out of the Gaza Strip, started launching rocket attacks against Israeli civilian population, thereby injuring and killing a few Israelis. So in retaliation to these attacks carried out by Hamas militants, the Israeli Air Force has used disproportionate force again in the Gaza Strip and conducted massive air raids and airstrikes. And along with killing a few militants, number of innocent civilians, including children, have been killed as well. Since many decades, Israeli position is that Jerusalem entirely belongs to Israel, and Israel has been denying Palestinians any rights over Jerusalem. But the global community has been critical of Israel's approach, especially its attempt to change the status quo and the demography by pushing illegal Jewish settlements. This aggressive stand of Israel was supported by the then president of US, Donald Trump. But now, following these violent incidents, the global community has been critical of Israel, especially for its excessive use of force even against civilians. These violent incidents in the Israel-Palestine region has the potential to trigger a new wave of militancy and terrorism, followed by acts of retaliation by the Israeli state, thereby destabilizing the whole West Asia region. If the situation continues to remain volatile, external players such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the others might try to exploit the situation for their own geopolitical reasons, and it could unleash a new wave of proxy war in the Middle East, where different geopolitical rivals will back their own outfits and proxies, such as Iran and Syria backing Hamas, while US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia will pursue their own covert strategy. And in the middle of this, Turkey, being a new entrant, is trying to exert itself into this conflict. And such external interference by geopolitical rivals could easily deteriorate the situation further, leading to the destabilization of West Asia. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, in which the writer evaluates the unprecedented economic crisis that India and the world are dealing with as a result of the pandemic. See, 2021 marks 30 years of the landmark economic reforms that India introduced in 1991, following the economic crisis of 1991. So considering the economic crisis that we are dealing with today, many experts have called for similar reforms, which the then Narasimha Rao government had introduced in order to help India to tide over the 1991 economic crisis. Several experts have drawn parallels between the two crisis situations, and they have said that such a crisis should be used as an opportunity to introduce wide sweeping reforms that can bring in structural fundamental changes in the economy in order to put the economy back on the growth trajectory. So in the context of this rising demand for major economic reforms, on the lines of reforms of 1991, the writer raises two important questions. One, he evaluates whether to introduce economic reforms, should we have a crisis situation? Or if you put it the other way around, it would mean that, is a crisis essential for introducing reforms? Or just because there is a crisis, is it mandatory to introduce wide sweeping economic reforms that can lead to fundamental changes and shifts in the economy? And the second question he raises is that, is the crisis of 2021 similar to the crisis we faced in 1991? Because since reforms are being demanded by comparing the two situations, it's only logical to compare whether the two crisis situations that India faced are they similar in their character and consequences. To answer the first question, he says that policy makers they always believe in incremental policy changes. That is a gradual step by step change because it always finds more acceptance amongst the stakeholders and faces very little resistance and also causes the least disruption and shock to the economy. Whereas a grand reform would mean that you're attempting a fundamental paradigm shift in the economic fundamentals by coming out with the so called Big Bang reforms, which will fundamentally alter the very structure of your economy. Now, in a regular situation, it might be impossible to introduce such Big Bang reforms because there would be a lot of resistance and opposition, and hence, a crisis situation creates the right opportunity and provides the right kind of space which the policy makers can use to push for wide sweeping changes, which we refer to as Big Bang reforms. While this argument is true, that a crisis situation presents an opportunity and creates the space to move away from slow incremental changes and directly adopt Big Bang reforms, it should also be noted by policymakers that during a crisis, there is going to be a lot of uncertainty and instability, and these unknown factors might make it very difficult to predict the long term consequences, and any sudden and ill thought out reform might end up further aggravating the crisis in the long run. So, in short, it means that the existence of a crisis doesn't necessitate the need for Big Bang reforms. And even though a crisis situation can be used for pushing fundamental reforms, it doesn't necessarily work in favor of the economy always due to the prevailing uncertainties and unknown factors. So now, if you go on to compare the character and the consequences of the 91 crisis with the current economic crisis, you will notice that there are several fundamental differences. See, back in 1991, the Indian economy was suffering largely because of its socialist policies, which had crippled India's production due to the bureaucratic red tape that had been created by the License Raj Inspector Raj mechanism. Prior to 1991, the Indian economy was severely restricted, with the state controlling all the manners of production, and there was hardly any scope for the private sector, with an absolute monopoly of the public sector. So, when India was hit by the 1991 crisis, and when the balance of payments crisis emerged, it was very clear as to what were India's problems, and it was very evident that India had to liberalize, privatize, and globalize its economy by eliminating or by removing these socialist era restrictions. And thus, the policymakers knew as to what exactly was wrong with the economy and what would be the consequences and what had to be the solution. So, during the 1991 crisis, all the factors leading to the crisis were endogenous to India. That is, the factors were completely internal to the Indian economy, and even the solution had to focus just on the domestic factors. So, accordingly, the then Narasimha Rao government, led by Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, introduced a series of landmark LPG reforms that opened up the Indian economy and eliminated the shackles of Inspector Raj and License Raj. And these Big Bang reforms set the stage for the Indian economy to explode in the coming years. But now, if you compare this crisis with the current economic crisis, the circumstances, the character, the consequences are entirely different. The current economic crisis is a direct result of the pandemic, which is not just internal to India, but it is a result of several exogenous factors. The dynamics of the pandemic is not entirely under India's control alone, and rather, it's a global disaster that is underway, and any solution to revive economic growth has to keep in mind the global factors and the global dimensions. Policymakers know very well that there are limitations to which our internal policies can influence global factors, and this itself creates challenges for our policy response. So, in this context, if the government pushes for Big Bang reforms just because there is a crisis, then the government may not be able to address several exogenous and global factors which are not essentially under India's control, thereby limiting the impact of these reforms. And worse, these reforms might end up hurting the Indian economy in the long run. The writer explains that in the current economic crisis, there are several uncertainties which cannot be easily predicted or anticipated, which includes the impact of lockdowns on government revenue and how would this affect government expenditure. Then, of course, there is the unpredictability of global factors. And as the pandemic continues to evolve, the economic consequences is going to be felt over the medium to long term. And there is always a lag effect between an adverse economic event such as a lockdown and its true impact on the economy. In such a dynamic, evolving situation, it would be hard to predict the exact consequences. Because, for example, if lockdowns are pushing more people into poverty, it is going to have a chain effect or a domino effect on the economy in the months to come. And hence, these consequences are not easy to anticipate or to predict, thus making the current economic crisis an enormous crisis. So the writer suggests that instead of pushing for reforms just for the sake of it, just because there is a crisis, it would be better for the government to wait and watch and to adopt a more incremental, gradual approach, depending on the day to day feedback that is being generated from the ground levels, which helps the government in understanding the true impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. And accordingly, step by step customized solutions will have to be designed, which would be much more efficient than any big bang reforms. Next, we have a column on page number 6 in which the writer evaluates last year's border tensions between India and China and the lessons that this border crisis in the Ladakh sector offers for India. See, we have discussed the background to this topic in several sessions, and it's been nearly a year since this border standoff began, and yet there are no signs of complete resolution because the disengagement process that had begun has been stalled by both the sides, and as of now, India and China are looking to maintain status quo. So, this crisis in Ladakh has imposed a huge cost on India, a strategic cost, because despite every attempt and strategy by India, Chinese troops continue to camp and they continue to control and patrol Indian controlled territory, which eventually weakens India's long term strategic position. So, in this crisis, the writer says that there are three important lessons that India can learn, which will help us in deterring any such Chinese misadventures in the future. See, now that China has refused to carry out complete disengagement, and now that China has repeatedly failed to live up to its promises and commitments, it is very clear that India's military strategy needs to be fine tuned and updated to deal with this renewed Chinese threat. Last year, when the crisis broke out, India's traditional military strategy was to implement its doctrine of punishment. This has been India's traditional approach since many decades against any adversary. And under this doctrine, the Indian military has always guaranteed massive punitive retaliation for any unnecessary unilateral aggression from an adversary. Under this strategy, India hopes to establish deterrence against the enemy. But however, this strategy of punishment doesn't seem to work against China. Because whenever adversaries such as China have displayed their aggression against India, India has often failed to retaliate and punish China as promised in the doctrine, thereby reducing and eroding the deterrent effect of this doctrine. Hence, the writer says that it is time for the Indian armed forces to shift towards the doctrine of denial, which happens to be a much more effective defense strategy to push back aggressive and expansionist countries such as China. In fact, during the Ladakh crisis of last year, India did implement this doctrine of denial successfully, at least for a short period in a particular location, when Indian forces, backed by RAW and the SFF, preemptively captured the strategic hill ranges in the Kailash range, which provided India an advantageous defense position from where India could aggressively defend its territory against any further Chinese misadventure. It was this preemptive operation of India which pushed back the Chinese, and this was essentially a strategy of denial where you're denying the enemy or the adversary any possible ground or leeway for advancing. And if such a doctrine is focused upon, then it will strengthen your defensive position. And these denial capabilities will end up deterring the enemy from resorting to such provocation again in the future. The next lesson for India is that India should learn imposing political costs on China because China is unlikely to be deterred by any material cost. In case of any future clashes or conflicts, India needs to keep in mind that China is not too bothered about the cost involved in any such conflict escalation. And even if it requires the deployment of lakhs of soldiers with expensive equipment, China would be more than ready to do that and bear this material cost due to its enormous defense budget and deep pockets. So India's counter strategy against Chinese aggression cannot be designed to impose a material cost on China because that wouldn't deter China. Instead, India's strategy should focus on imposing a political cost by projecting that India would turn permanently hostile to China if it were to continue behaving as an aggressive neighbor. And this fear of having a permanently hostile neighbor, such as India, will bring in an added political cost on the Chinese leadership because any long term permanent hostility between these two large countries is going to significantly hurt China as well. So, with the right messaging, if India can indicate to China that India wouldn't hesitate to turn permanently hostile and actively destabilize the region against China's favor, if China were to provocate India, would send out the right message, as China would then be forced to factor in these political costs. Next, the third lesson for India is the balance that it needs to strike with regard to its military and strategic posture in the Indian Ocean region and the Himalayan mountains. See, the Indian Ocean region has been traditionally India's strategic backyard, where right now China is emerging as a fierce rival and it is engaged in an intense competition with India for diplomatic and strategic influence. So while India was busy in countering this Chinese threat in the Indian Ocean, China opened a new front along the Himalayan borders, thereby distracting India and diverting Indian resources and energy away from the Indian Ocean towards the Himalayan mountains. While this focus on the Himalayan borders was essential to deter the Chinese threat, India will have to keep in mind that in the long run and in the broader scheme of things, the Indian Ocean is always more important for India as compared to the Himalayan borders. And accordingly, India will have to keep up its strong presence in the Indian Ocean while simultaneously dealing with the Chinese threat on the land borders in the Himalayan belt. So these key lessons might help New Delhi in managing the strategic competition with China while helping India successfully deter the various acts of provocation and instigation that China is engaging in against India. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: examine in detail the latest Israel Palestinian clashes. The second question: the character and consequences of the economic crisis of 91 and 2021 are different. Analyze. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.